This video is a video I made of an accident flight that occurred during a dusk departure from Green Bay, Wisconsin to Ephriam, Wisconsin. The flight was an IFR flight in a Cessna 182 equipped with Garmin 1000s. Pilot had a young passenger, student pilot with him. They took off from Green Bay at about dusk, and they were going to, well, they filed an IFR flight, but before they got to the airport, the pilot canceled the IFR flight and made an attempt to land and misjudged his height, his position, and crashed in Peninsula State Park. He, according to the NTSB, had controlled flight into terrain. Not uncontrolled, controlled. So in this simulation, I'm looking up the information on the Green Bay Airport for its elevation, and I'm setting the elevation into the altimeter. Now, the weather is clear. The flight is 28 minutes. You'll be going over water, Door County Peninsula. Well, Door Peninsula will be on the right, and Ephriam is just a small field that is about the size of Newman's Field. And now I'm setting the course direction indicator for the direction of the runway that I intend to land on, and it is runway 14. So having set that into the CDI, now I'm going to the 530 for Garmin. I have preloaded the flight plan for an RNAV GPS approach to runway 14, and that has been set into the Garmin 530. And as we move along, we'll track our progress along the magenta line, and as we get closer to the destination, at some point I'll make the decision to cancel IFR and hand fly an approach into Ephriam on runway 14. Ofen is the initial approach fix. Jewelry is the final approach fix into runway 14. So the Baron flies about 165 to 170 knots. Now that's a bit faster than the Cessna 182, but this flight will be real time, so if there's a little bit of boredom in between here, it's because that's the way it is in real flying, and this is a real flight. So here I'm using the ForeFlight application on my iPad mini, getting information about the approach. I have the approach plate here for the RNAV approach. I want it to be at, I think, 2,300 feet at Jewelry. And then if I was to fly the approach using the autopilot, I would have to be at 2,300 feet to intercept the glide slope. Now, the autopilot works really well. I have set in here that I want vectors to final. So as soon as I activate that vectors to final approach, I'm going to be directed to the final approach fix. But in this instance, I canceled IFR and flew the approach by hand without autopilot. This was a very beautiful part of the country. If you've ever been there, I've been there on vacation a few times by car, and it's very beautiful, somewhat remote. And flying at night, as this scenario unfolded, it became increasingly clear that it was difficult to see the horizon. especially as you headed east. So we're cleared for takeoff. All the run-up checks have been done. Although I don't need to have flaps set here for takeoff, I set them anyway. And so here we are, charging down runway 36, heading north in Beach Barren. Flight Simulator is so great because you can create any conditions you want. You can create the weather you want. You can create the airports, the situations. It's a great practice tool for flying procedures to airports, any airports. The view is really nice. I'm flying this flight in 2D, which simply means I'm looking at a TV screen in front of me. I do have three-dimensional Oculus Rift for a virtual flight experience, which when you put the goggles on, you really think that you're in 3D space in that airplane cockpit. And you look all over and up and down and all around. You really, for all intents and purposes, except for the jolting around and feeling a huge machine underneath you, you really feel like you're in that airplane. And I really like to fly with the goggles on. But for this flight, I just decided to do a 2D demonstration flight. And right now I'm climbing north. Actually, I'm going a little slow. I should be going a little faster, but we're climbing north to get to 4,000 feet, which was the altitude of the accident aircraft. So if we look behind, you can see some of the area near the Green Bay Airport. You can see the runway right in the background there. The night of the flight was crystal clear, but the interesting thing about this flight was that there was a moon, almost full moon, 98% full, that was situated 2 degrees off the horizon in the east. Now, I don't have the ability to turn this flight simulator into a planetarium to position the moon exactly where I want it, well, where it would be on a certain month, day, year, time. I do have, later on in this video, I think, superimposed what the moon would have looked like to the pilot as they cruised north toward their landing destination. Pretty impressive to see a huge moon reflected off the water on Lake Michigan. Definitely get your attention because it would be big. The rays would be reflected off the water, especially at 4,000 feet, and you'd have quite a lit up landscape, I think. Anyway, I'm now turning to get established on the magenta course. The miles are decrementing, and as soon as I get situated on the magenta course, I'll use the autopilot. It's my preferred way of flying these kinds of legs, just because it's easy. You reach down and you'll see we'll set the autopilot switch on, and then I'll switch the altitude hold on, and then nav. So here's the autopilot control. That's the nav switch. And as soon as we do that, the airplane responds to the commands and starts following the flight plan. And in Flight Simulator, this is kind of tricky because every aircraft manufacturer of this software kind of treats their autopilots differently. Of course, with different airplanes, you have different models of autopilots, but this Beach Barren behaves just exactly as you want it to. So now that I'm on this course, I'll adjust the, well, of course, before I engage the autopilot, I trim the airplane to optimum trim. And power settings, the manifold pressure, and the prop RPMs are being adjusted for the rest of this leg. In these twin engine airplanes, you have to be careful to keep things in sync, which is something you have to work at doing. But here we are cruising about 165 knots, looking out toward the northwest. Flight Simulator actually, X-Plane actually depicts the scenery exactly as you would expect it. It'll place the airports and cities and roads where they should be, and it's really fun to fly at night because you get a lot of illumination of roads and towns and things like that. So, moving along here, looking out to the east, there's Door County Peninsula. And zooming around a little bit. So you see it's still daytime. Going to intersect that line, and then we'll make a little jog to the left. Out in that direction is Menominee. And out in this direction would be Sturgeon Bay. Very beautiful country. Here's the Baron in flight, lovely airplane. This model is from Coronado, one of the big designers of aircraft software. I have a number of their aircraft in my livery, and I like them because they're very beautifully modeled and they behave in a very realistic way. Because the people that test the software are skilled in aerodynamics, they're pilots who give input. It's very well done and very well modeled. Now in this flight I have set the atmospheric conditions to display stars at night. And you can just see them start to appear here. Beautiful view of the shoreline. Now we're heading for the I would say the initial approach fix. We'll see that on the Garmin 530. This is a beautiful shot of the profile of the airplane against the sunset. When my father used to fly out of Park Township Airport in Holland, I would sometimes go with him in the old Aeronca Champ. And he would say that watching the sun set below the horizon was just like seeing somebody take a hold of that disc with their fingers and slowly dragging it down below the horizon. I remember him saying that and indeed experienced it. It's a beautiful experience. But you better have the airplane pretty close to the airport because when that sun goes down, it isn't long and it's dark. And when you're a VFR pilot, like my dad was in that old Champ, we got on the ground before dark because Park Township is right next to Lake Michigan. So we're cruising along here. What are we doing on the engine controls? Looking good. We're going 165 knots. All right. Starting to approach in the view there is the approach pattern toward the top. KSUE, the Sturgeon Bay. And if we pan over there, you can just see it coming into view. Now, if you want to learn this Garmin 530, 430 business, this is a really good way to do it. I don't fully understand the thing yet, although I've used it an awful lot, and I can do a lot with it. There is KOCQ. I don't think that is not Menominee. I don't know what that is. There's Menominee up there. You can just see it off to the northwest. Getting darker. Still cruising along. Checking our panel lights, taxi, landing lights, strobe lights, beacon, nav lights, all on. Another nice shot of the aircraft against the night sky. I've suppressed the noise of the engine on this. I like to listen to aircraft engines, but after a while it gets to your ears, and in this case, since this is just a simulation flight of a demonstration nature, we just keep it simple. There's the approach depicted. Getting closer to Ofen. So normally you'd fly to Ofen, make a right turn to the final approach fix, Jewelry. You'd be at 2,300 feet. You'd then descend at 3 degrees and you'd nicely approach runway 14, as you can see there. So why wouldn't you land just as I've been describing and use the autopilot in approach mode and let the autopilot guide you down? Well, maybe you don't know how. Maybe you don't feel proficient enough to do it. These Garmins are not the simplest things to use. You have to use them a lot in order to understand them. You got to be quick. You can't be fumbling around, experimenting. And the best place to learn to do this is on the ground in one of these. It'll get you a long way. And with Andy Millen conducting the classes for the IMC Club using a real, honest-to-God Garmin 430 simulator provided by Garmin, that's a good way to learn. But this also has got its benefits. It does just about everything the real Garmin does. I can create flight plans with programs like SimBrief and export those program waypoints into this Garmin. I use ForeFlight with the Garmin. There's a lot of ways to get a flight plan in there, modify them. But the thing about Flight Simulator is you don't have any knobs you can twist or dial, and that makes it very much more interesting. That's Menominee, I believe. So when you're flying with a computer and a 2D TV screen in front of you, you got to have some way to turn dials. And you use a mouse to do this. And you got to learn to do it right, or it gets very frustrating. So we're getting closer to Ephriam, and it's quite dark out. Stars are out. So if it's getting dark out and you're not going to use an autopilot to land, then you're going to have to follow that cluster of instruments precisely in order to be where you're supposed to be and when you're supposed to be. And people do it all the time, visually, by hand. But the ones that do it and do it well do it a lot. That's the way you are proficient. And in this kind of flying, it seems to me, it's all about proficiency. How confident and how good are you at doing what is required to safely land this airplane under these conditions? Now, one of the things I would be looking for on an approach would be the visual approach slope indicator, because that will keep you at the right descent angle. But not all airports have this. In this case, as I reviewed this video that I'm making, I noted that my destination airport had a malfunction on their visual approach slope indicator. And if one had read the NOTAMs, one might have noted that the red lights were burned out. So all you had was white. So if you were coming in and you were looking and you didn't sit, you'd think you were high. But then when the reds don't show up, you know there's something weird going on. And in this particular flight that I made, for some reason that 3 Delta 2 airport, VASI, wasn't working right. Now I'm getting to a point here near this intersection where the cursor was, where I'm going to make the decision to disconnect the autopilot, cancel IFR, and fly the airplane in manually. There goes the autopilot. Boom. Okay. Here goes the switch. I turned it off. The autopilot is off. The aircraft is under my control. Now, as I'm moving in here to position myself for the approach, I'm constantly looking at this 430 or 530. Constantly. It's a great help. And I can't imagine flying without it. It'd be very difficult because, well, you wouldn't have as much of a reference visually. So it's much easier when you can have good situational awareness and be heading for your waypoints. So now I'm starting to lose altitude because I got in the right position. So I'm going to have to reduce speed and start descending. Remember, I'm at 4,000 feet, and if I want to be in good shape, I've got to be at about 2,300 feet at the final approach fix. So we're descending a little faster than 500 feet a minute. I'm looking out here in the direction of the airport. I think I see it in the northeast corner there. Some more lights just popped into view. That's a flight sim characteristic. Anyway, maybe we can take another look at this GPS. I'm getting down to the point where I could extend the landing gear or the flaps. The flaps are now set in the approach position. Do we have 3 green? Okay, there's jewelry. Still can't see the airport. Getting closer. You got to keep the speed up. Props are full forward. May have to do a little climbing to get back to my height. Kind of nursing this thing along, finding the appropriate altitude and speed. And you're looking for the airport. All right, I'm about to hit the final approach fix, and that will certainly help. There's 3 green down there. So we're in the landing configuration, approaching the shoreline. You can see the airport just off to the, well, it's almost in the center of the screen. Can't see the runway lights, but I can see the outline of the airport. Lighting there. Starting to get lined up. We're pretty close to being right on the localizer. Now I don't have the autopilot approach mode set in here, but if I did, you'd see it reflected in the HSI. That's looking good. But at night, it's very easy to get confused. I know this because coming back in my sailboat from Sturgeon Bay, we're going to Manistee at night. As we approached the shoreline near Manistee, I really had a very difficult time finding the harbor entrance because of all the lights on the waterfront, on the shoreline. Car lights, business lights, street lights. looking for the rotating beacons, it's confusing, and you can easily end up in the wrong place. Until you get closer, you are kind of winging it, so to speak. In this case, these instruments are lined up. So I'm heading right for the airport there. It looks pretty small yet at this point. I know there are trees that are close to the runway. You don't want to come in too fast and too low, for sure. On the other hand, you don't want to overshoot. So landing at night, I'm looking for the VASI. There are the runway lights. There's a beacon. I see two white. There is what the moon would look like on the night of the accident. So that sight picture looks good. I can just maintain my speed and my altitude and miss those trees. You can't see the trees. I know they're there. In fact, you can just see a little outline of it there on the left corner of the runway. They disappeared now, so I'm high enough. There's the moon. There's a picture of the runway. And coming in on the threshold. No red lights. Okay, we have arrived. Runway 14, Ephriam 3 and Delta 2. So I guess the whole point of this exercise was to just simulate what it would feel like to make this flight and just experience the atmosphere and the beauty of the night. Thanks for watching.